A few weeks ago, a friend of mine found a GTX 1070 Ti in a dumpster. For some reason, the previous owner discarded it along with an entire PC. My guess is that something in the system was faulty and they assumed none of the components had any value. Either way, I ended up with an EVGA GTX 1070 Ti FTW Ultra Silent ACX 3.0 model. After testing it, thoroughly cleaning it, and applying new thermal paste, the card turned out to be fully functional and looked great aside from a few scratches on the aluminum shroud. I have a lot of experience with the GTX 1070 non-Ti, which I believe is still one of the best price to performance GPUs on the used market, with 8GB of VRAM. It's a great choice if you're willing to sacrifice some modern features and long-term driver support. The 1070 Ti offers around 15% more performance than the standard 1070. Currently, a used 1070 in the US will cost around $80 to $90, while the 1070 Ti typically runs about $20 to $30 more. Both are solid options if you're aware of their limitations. The GTX 1070 Ti features a 1607 MHz base clock, a 1685 MHz boost clock, and a memory frequency of 2002 MHz. Its 8GB of GDDR5 video memory runs on a 256-bit bus. The card also has 2,432 shading units, 152 texture mapping units, and 64 render output units. With a TDP of 180 watts, a quality power supply of at least 450 watts should be sufficient to run a system with a 1070 Ti. In 2024, the primary use case for this card is typically 1080p gaming. While many older titles and esports game can run smoothly at higher resolutions, the realistic expectation for an older GPU like the 1070 Ti, especially when paired with budget components, should be full HD gaming. Today, I'm testing the GTX 1070 Ti in my GPU test system, which includes a Ryzen 5 5600X, 32GB of DDR4 RAM, and Windows 10. I'll be running games primarily in native 1080p, aiming for around 60 FPS in slower paced single player games, and higher frame rates in esports titles. These results are meant as a reference for what the 1070 Ti is capable of, rather than optimized settings for everyone's preferences. Starting with Counter-Strike 2, I ran the game on the very high preset. After a few rounds on a Dust 2 practice match, the average frame rate came in just under 170 FPS. With solid percentile lows, this level of performance should satisfy most players. Next, I tested Fortnite using the DirectX 12 API with the medium preset at native 1080p. The average frame rate during a match was just over 100 FPS with stable percentile lows and only a few noticeable dips. With more competitive settings and enough CPU headroom, the 1070 Ti could easily push for a higher average frame rate than this. As expected, GTA 5 posed no challenge for the GTX 1070 Ti, even with all graphic settings maxed out, including the advanced settings. After spending a considerable amount of time driving and exploring different in-game environments, the average frame rate settled at around 116 FPS. Forza Horizon 5 also performed well in the high preset. The built-in benchmark recorded an average of 91 FPS with excellent percentile lows, making for a smooth experience. Cyberpunk 2077, however, was more demanding. With high settings at native resolution, the GTX 1070 Ti managed to deliver around 50 FPS in the more intensive areas of the game. With medium settings or some upscaling, a steady 60 FPS is easily within reach here. In Baldur's Gate 3, using the medium preset and DX11 at native 1080p, the GTX 1070 Ti performed well. Even in a fairly intensive area, the frame rate consistently stayed above 60 FPS with higher numbers and less demanding scenes. For Assassin's Creed Mirage, I ran the built-in benchmark at the medium preset and native 1080p, resulting in a solid average of 74 FPS. Hogwarts Legacy, using the high preset with TAA and no upscaling, delivered a steady 55 to 60 FPS. This game consumed the most video memory of those that I tested, peaking at over 6GB, which is reassuring given the 1070 Ti's 8GB of VRAM. Starfield, which lists the GTX 1070 Ti as the minimum recommended GPU, did struggle a bit. Using the medium preset with 50% render resolution, I averaged around 46 FPS in the demanding New Atlantis area. While this level of performance is enough to play the game, the visual quality suffers significantly. Lastly, I tested Black Myth Wukong on low settings with TSR and no frame generation. After running the built-in benchmark, the GTX 1070 Ti delivered a solid and playable average of 47 FPS. Overall, the GTX 1070 Ti still holds up as a solid budget video card, capable of running many games at native 1080p with medium to high settings, and delivering more than enough performance for most users. Its shortcomings become more apparent in newer, more demanding titles where its older architecture and lack of modern features start to show limitations. That said, for around $110 in 2024, it's still a decent option for anyone who understands its limitations. I believe it will remain usable for a few more years in most cases. It should pair well with a budget system featuring a CPU like a Ryzen 5 3600 or even an i5 9400. Anyways, I think I'll hang on to my dumpster fine GTX 1070 Ti and maybe revisit the card in the future to see how it continues to perform. As for my upcoming video plans, I aim to release another episode of my Flip Up series in the next few weeks. I also have a lot of hardware on hand that I can create content around. If you'd like to stay updated on that, consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. If you have any questions, experiences with the 1070 Ti, or suggestions for better budget GPU alternatives, feel free to drop a comment. Thanks for watching.